information that I like very much. I find it extremely fascinating. Before we get started, I did want to stop one rumor. I want to clarify, this is not a police lineup photo. This is my latest passport photo. We're talking about surveillance, and actually we're just going to talk about a very small piece of surveillance. If you look at the entire line of what involves surveillance, you're talking about collecting samples efficiently on the farm. You're talking about tests that perform well, and then you're talking about some process to integrate those data in with useful farm data, productivity data, for example, or perhaps environmental data, and then the complex process of actually analyzing those data to make it knowledge, make it information that you can actually use on a farm. We don't have time to do that entire process, and actually I'd have to confess, we still have a lot of work to do to finish that entire circle, that entire feedback loop, the entire process of collecting samples, turning it into data, and then making it useful information on the farm. And so today we're really going to focus mostly on how we can collect samples efficiently and how we can turn them into diagnostic results. The emphasis today is really on PRRS, but in fact we're in the process of expanding that information to beyond PRRS to any of a number of other endemic and even exotic infectious diseases of swine. Just something in the way of introduction, because even within the US, most people don't know where Iowa is located. You can ask any New Yorker or anybody from California, they would have no concept of where Iowa is located. So I want to clarify that we are in the center of the US. This photograph this map is actually from 1880, and these black dots represent pigs distributed across the United States. And you can see most of the black dots cluster in the state of Iowa. So this is 1880. Iowa was first in production, pig production in 1880. We still are number one in pig production, mostly because we have a very fertile soil, so we can grow corn and soybeans very efficiently. You know, there's some historical decisions made that impact the entire course of your history. And so this is a case where our forefathers could grow more corn than they could consume. And so they were faced with a decision of producing pigs or whiskey. And in this case, they chose they chose pigs. But if they chose differently, I could be at a whiskey convention right now instead of a pig convention. And so we don't have much beside agriculture, but I do want to point out that we have one claim to cultural fame, this relatively famous picture called American Gothic. American Gothic actually refers to the architecture of the house in the background. This architecture is actually called American Gothic, and it's characterized by these curved windows, which you can see. The people in the foreground are actually the Iowa artist's sister, and the dentist, the town dentist. Nobody knows why he's carrying a pitchfork. We didn't know in 1930 when this was painted, and we don't know today, but we're still proud of his fantastic artistry. And so we're here today because we have a responsibility in terms of swine health and the control of infectious diseases. And we're here in particular talking about surveillance because we can't look at pigs and know what infections they have. In fact, whether you look at human health or animal health, with rare exceptions, we can't look at people or pigs or whatever and know what they have. The exceptions might be smallpox and measles, but they are the exceptions. And so here in this photograph, we see a picture of someone who's recovered from smallpox. This picture was taken in 1900. The person's standing in their backyard. The white background is actually a bed sheet thrown over the clothesline, and the person who took the picture is the attending physician. But except for these rare exceptions, we can't look at animals and know what's happened. We need data. We need surveillance. And so historically, we have collected samples. We have collected samples to try to understand what's going on, but we haven't done a very good job at surveillance. So what is the difference? And I'm going to suggest that the difference is a sample is a picture. It's static. It's a one point in time. Whereas surveillance is actually a movie. if we have continuous information over time, we can see where the movie starts and how the movie ends. And the advantage of surveillance is if you don't like the way the movie ends, if you don't like the health status of your pigs, if you feel like you can do better, you can change the movie the next time. And so the entire purpose of doing surveillance is making the movie come out the way you would like it to come out. So for surveillance to work, it has to provide a return on investment. It has to, and by that I mean we have to get more out of it than we put into it. It has to be simple. That is, each step in the process has to be clear and easy, from the collection on the farm to the analysis of the data to the response. It has to be accepted by the people who are going to use it. And by that I mean the users, the people who are actually implementing the system, have to believe that it makes their job easier or better. It has to be timely and accurate. And by that I mean we need to have good labs and good tests, and in particular for surveillance data, for surveillance tests, you have to have highly specific, highly reproducible tests. That is not always the case right now. This is an area that we need to continue to improve on. But you have to have highly specific tests, because once you start reporting false positives, the people using the system begin to lose confidence. So we have to have results that we can trust in. And then it has to be flexible. I mentioned before, we're going to talk mostly about PRRS today, but there's quite a number of other pathogens that are of interest. So we need a system that we can use not only for PRRS, but for quite a number of other pathogens. So the fundamentals of oral fluid diagnostics, and this is really a primer. This is just a little bit in terms of definitions and vocabulary. So why do we say oral fluid and not saliva? And the reason is that, in fact, oral fluid consists both of saliva coming from the salivary glands, but also there's a lot of transudate that comes from the capillaries and crosses the mucosal membranes into the mouth. So in a typical adult male, there may be a liter of fluid that comes from the capillaries into the mouth. We collect our sample by using an absorbent device, and by definition, samples collected from the buccal cavity with an absorptive device have both this transudate as well as saliva, and it's defined, the sample you collect in is defined as oral fluid, not just saliva. And so why are oral fluids good for diagnostics? And the reason is it contains both pathogens locally produced and from blood, as well as antibodies produced both locally and from blood. This is not actually a new area. There's extensive research history. Probably the most pivotal date is this date of 1986, when there are two papers that came out, one reporting the detection of HIV in oral fluids, and one reporting the detection of HIV antibodies in oral fluids. That's on the human side, obviously. Within a few years, we had our first FDA-approved ELISA for use in oral fluids. They've continued to expand that technology, improve that technology, and today we have rapid in-home tests for oral fluids. So what we're talking about in pigs has a solid foundation in research and use on the human side. We actually began our work on oral fluids test development in 2005, strictly by chance. It was not, we're not that smart. It was simply by chance. By February of 2010, we had enough confidence in what we were doing that we actually started running tests in the Iowa State University Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory. And you can see in 2010, we ended up running around 10,000 tests. That increased in 2011 to 32,000 tests, in 2012 to around 60,000 tests, in 2013, 94,000 tests, and this year we expect to run around 130,000 tests. So every year we see greater acceptance, greater use of oral fluid diagnostics in swine production, not just in Iowa, but really for the country. We receive samples from across the country. Just a short thing about how you collect oral fluids from pigs, and really it is all about pig behavior. It's a pretty simple process. Let me just see if our videos are going to run. This is a short video from Steve Henry, who is a prominent practitioner from Kansas. This is how he collects oral fluids. Obviously, this is in a wean to finish facility. You can see it's not too difficult to get pigs interested in chewing on ropes. Actually, personally, I like to use a slightly thicker rope. Here, Steve is using actually it's a canine semen collection system. So the plastic bag actually funnels the liquid into the tube. And that's a sample. Here's another example. We do most of our collections from pen bases, penned groups of pigs, but you can collect from individual animals as well. We're going to be talking about this study later on. This is a study that Dr. Kid One-Rat performed at Iowa State. Let's see if we can get out of here. This is typically the way you see it done in our finishers. And I'd like you to draw your attention to these painted pigs. Here we have a green painted pig, we have a red painted pig. We're going to talk about these pigs later. This is a very enthusiastic guy. We're going to talk about those painted pigs a little bit later on. But this is typical of what you might see in our setups. You saw one way you saw how Steve collected oral fluids from a rope. This is another example, just to show you how easy it is to do this. Jeremy has put the rope in a plastic bag. This again is an individually housed boar. So there's a sample. So collection is relatively easy. It doesn't take very much in terms of materials. It takes a cooperative pig. Our recommendations in routine use is to collect in the mornings, to use cotton ropes, to adjust the rope to the pig size. And by that I mean, we'd like to have the rope come to the back of the pig so that the pigs need to raise their head. If they have to raise their head, you get a slightly cleaner sample. And then you saw how to extract the fluid from the rope. We recommend taking very good care of these samples. Antibodies are more robust, but for PCRs, we really need to chill these samples or freeze them as quickly as possible, and then run the test. From our work, we've done most of our work in smaller pens with 25 to 30 pigs. And what we see, once pigs are trained, then around 75% of the pigs in a pen will interact with the rope in a space of 20 to 30 minutes. And by training, there are some tips. When you go into a wean to finish barn, we recommend that the first time you hang ropes, you leave them for 1 hour. That 60-minute period of time lets the pigs train each other. It takes one pig to get started on the rope, and then everybody else wants to get on the rope too. So that 60 minutes gets all the pigs trained. Thereafter, that 20-minute period of time is perfectly fine. In recently weaned pigs, it's oftentimes helpful to knot the rope and throw it on the floor so that the pigs can explore it in a non-threatening manner. Once they chew on the rope on the floor, then they understand that it's perfectly harmless. You can hang the rope and you'll be very successful in collection. I mentioned we recommend using cotton rope, and this is the reason. This is a study that was published last year, 2013, and we compared 3 different materials. We looked at cotton, hemp rope, and nylon rope. We collected samples from 104 pens and then ran the PRRS ELISA and PCR. For the ELISA values, you can see that SPs really came out very close together, and the percentage of positive pens are about the same. But you can see here in the right-hand column that the material itself had a huge impact on PCR results. So from cotton rope, you can see we had 33% positives. 33 out of those 104 samples were positive. But from hemp, we only had 5 positives, and from nylon, only 2 positives. We didn't go any further. We didn't explore the mechanisms, what's going on here. It's easy to hypothesize that nylon, because of its electrostatic charges, could be trapping virus. I don't really have a good explanation for hemp, But we did notice that there was a lot of direct material in those samples. Perhaps there's PCR inhibitors in that particular rope material. I mentioned taking good care of your samples. You've already done the work. You need to take good care of your samples. This is a study we did looking at the ability of the virus, nucleic acid, and antibodies to persist over time at different temperatures. You can see that you saw relatively rapid inactivation, both in nucleic acid and antibody at 30 degrees. At 20 degrees, we saw some inactivation, but here at minus 24 and 10 degrees, we had good stability for both antibody and virus. So take care of samples. So now you have your sample in hand. So what do we know about PCR performance? Here's just a few examples, because remember, ultimately we're talking not just about PRRS, but a number of other pathogens. So here's an example of looking at classical swine fever virus over time in oral fluids. There's differences in response depending on the particular isolate they used, but that's entirely compatible with the literature. But you can see relatively prolonged detection of virus in oral fluids following inoculation. Here's PCV2, and again, we're looking at a relatively persistent infection. This is some work out of Dr. Presnick's lab, and you can see following inoculation, they were able to detect virus out to 100 days post-inoculation. Here's some work on influenza out of the University of Minnesota. They compared nasal swabs to oral fluids. Here's 60 nasal swabs and the percent positives over time. You can see that their last positives were detected on day 16. Here's oral fluids from the same group of animals, and you can see that they were able to detect positives out to day 69. So quite a large difference. Here's PED. We started looking at oral fluids for PEDV last year, of course. And you can see on the left, here's fecal swab results from 56 pigs. Percent positives, here's 1 day post-inoculation, just over 20% positive. Day 2, day 3, day 7, 100% positive. Day 14, we start to see a decline, and so forth. On the right is the results from oral fluids, and you can see that all oral fluids are positives all the way through. Why are we detecting PDB in oral fluids? And the answer is that pigs are always questing in their environment. They're sampling things. That's their nature. That's their behavior. And so you find things in oral fluid that are actually in the environment. In this case, it works to our advantage. The same thing could happen for salmonella or other environmental contaminants. So things that are in the environment, the pigs will find for us and give us a sample. This is another way of looking at PEDV. Here's the CTs on the fecal swabs on the left and oral fluids on the right, and you can see they're really identical. So the CTs are corresponding whether you take fecal swabs or oral fluids. Now, which you find easier is up to you. And so what's the possibilities for PCRs? We've worked with African swine fever. Essentially all of these viruses, these pathogens with the check marks have been looked at by somebody someplace. The one that we have not been successful, and I don't think anybody has, is Mycoplasma pneumoniae. I'm sure at some point in time we'll figure out the problem with Mycoplasma pneumoniae, and we will ultimately detect it, but right now there are no good PCRs. There is no way to monitor pneumonia using oral fluids. Here's a note of caution. Remember we said that assays need to be highly repeatable and highly reproducible, highly specific. And so for PCRs, that means these assays must be optimized for the oral fluids themselves. Ideally, what we want for a PCR assay is some probability of detection that reflects the concentration of the analyte in the sample. And you want, ultimately, like one line of probability for all assays and all laboratories. So we did a study, we did a ring trial. We were looking at influenza, we did a comparison in 8 laboratories. What we did is at each of these concentrations, each of these dilutions, we sent all the laboratories 20 samples at each concentration, which gives a total of 160 samples at each of these 8 10-fold dilutions. Asked the laboratories to run whatever PCR protocols they had on hand, and then we compared the performance. And so here's what we saw. Obviously, this is not a single probability line. This is many probability lines, meaning that we're not getting tests that are highly uniform across these laboratories. In fact, we have, if you use this point here, this is a 50% probability of detection point, meaning that at this dilution, this laboratory was able to detect half of the samples as being positive. And so what you see are these 13 different PCRs across here, and you see quite a remarkable difference in detection rates. A twofold difference, or excuse me, 100-fold difference, 2 logs difference in detection. This is not information that was received very well by the laboratories, but this is the reality. And so somehow we need to get our laboratories on board so that they start looking and comparing and determining what is the best protocols for PCR performance. So the important point here, or one of the important points, is I've had some friends of mine tell me that PCRs are facts, and what we have to understand is that PCRs are estimates. All of our tests are estimates. And some tests give better estimates than others. We need to find the tests to give the best estimates and make sure all of our laboratories run the best tests. So how about antibody detection? This is Luminex, and what I'd like to be showing here is that a number of different platforms give very similar results. And in fact, if you look at the human literature, because we all know that they've been working in this area longer than we have, there's some publications in the human literature that say if you have a good serum antibody assay, you have a good serum ELISA, that ELISA can be adapted to detection of antibodies in oral fluids. And the adaptation may involve a change in incubation period. It may involve a change in sample dilutions. It may certainly involve a change in the reagents you use, and almost always involves a change in the cutoff. But nonetheless, if you have a good ELISA, you can probably adapt that to oral fluids. So here's a case. This is Luminex. And what we're seeing here is a nice IgM response in oral fluids, and then a nice IgG response to PRRS virus. This is some work that Dr. Kitty Wunrat published. Similar results. This is an adaptation of the PRRS serum ELISA, X3 ELISA, for detection of IgM, IgA, and IgG in oral fluids. Here's IgG, and you can see this prolonged detection of antibody. Here we are out to day 91. Here in the open triangles is IgA, again a nice response, and then a classic IgM response, which pretty much is extinguished by 28 days post-inoculation. I want to make the point, IDEX does have an oral fluid antibody ELISA currently available. Their assay gives slightly different results than our initial serum adapted ELISA. And so this is a graph showing the same samples run either using the serum adapted ELISA here in red or orange, and here is their assay. And so on the oral fluid ELISA assay, you can get SP values of even 10 or 12. It has a very large amplitude, which I think is to our advantage because if you have a big amplitude, you can see changes better over time. So the point here is some of the numbers you're going to see here would be different if we ran the same samples on the commercial oral fluid ELISA. Here's influenza A virus. This is some work done by Dr. Panya Singh. But again, you're seeing, here's our negative controls. Here's animals who were vaccinated with influenza vaccine and then challenged. Very, very fast response here on an NP ELISA, nucleoprotein ELISA. And here's unvaccinated animals. Again, a very fast response. And then we return to PCV2. This actually is data from the same study done in Dr. Presnick's lab, showing an IgG response on the left and an IgA response on the right. So we have a lot of evidence that what was reported in the human literature earlier, that is that these assays can be adapted for detection of antibodies and oral fluids. We have a lot of information now that it's true. We still need to do the work, and in particular, we need to do the work to get these assays commercially available. Again, because we need to all be running assays that are uniform across laboratories. But there's every reason to believe that we can be successful. And that's important because our ultimate goal is this efficient surveillance system. Here's one caution on oral fluid antibody assays. These assays are very sensitive and can detect antibody in the environment. Before we saw we could detect virus in the environment, and now we're going to see that we can detect antibody in the environment. And the source of that antibody, this was a surprise to us, was spray-dried plasma, spray-dried porcine plasma. So this is actually a case that came into the diagnostic lab. This was from a herd that was PRRS negative, and they were very unhappy when we came up with positive results. And so in the course of the investigation, the practitioner on this farm suggested we look at the feed. And so Dr. John Johnson, who was head of our serology section at that time, took 5 grams of feed and simply put it in diluent that came with the kit, and then ran the diluent on oral fluid ELISA at various dilutions. Here's the dilutions here. And so you can see he was able to detect plenty of PRRS antibody that came from the spray-dried plasma. We actually, to confirm these results, sent the same samples to the Beringer lab in Ames, Iowa, and you can see that they essentially duplicated the results in our lab. And so that's a word of caution. If you're using spray-dried porcine plasma, you're likely to detect any of the antibodies against any of the pathogens in the region from which the plasma came. And so, a word of caution. So we have these assays. We think they run pretty well. But let's get some proof about how well they work. And so the first thing I want to talk about is looking at the PRRS assay performance under experimental conditions. This is looking at both PCRs and ELISAs. This has been published in 2010, 2012, again, work done by Dr. Kitty Wunrat. So we performed 3 trials, 24 bores in each of these trials. Actually, that's not quite true. There were 24 in the first trial, 22 in the second trial, and 24 in the third trial. The black line is actually showing how much oral fluid, the mean volume of oral fluid is collected from these bores over time. And you can see for the most part, it was plenty, somewhere around 15 mils on average in each of these trials. And then the red line is the quantitative PCRs in serum. And you can see, as Dr. Murtaugh referred to earlier, differences in the level of viremia. This one actually is Minnesota 184, which is considered a virulent PRRS isolate, and we've got 12 logs here at the peak around day 7. The blue line is PCRs on oral fluid. We're able to collect oral fluid samples daily. We could not bleed daily, but so we have daily information on PCRs from oral fluids. And you can see in every case, we were detecting virus out to day 21, both in serum and oral fluids. One important question was, how quickly are we detecting virus by oral fluids in these animals? On day 1, 10% were PCR positive. On day 2, 76% positive. Day 3, 94% positive. And by day 4, all the bores were PCR positive in oral fluids. We can look at that in another way. Here's our 3 trials. 1, 2, and 3. Here's Minnesota 184 again. This is the type 1 virus in trial 2 and modified live in trial 1. And we're looking at oral fluids and serum samples over time. Here's day 0, day 7, day 14, day 21. Here we have 1 false positive on this bore. Moving to day 7, you can see on both oral fluid and serum, we have 100% positivity by PCR. Moving to day 14, you can see more positive on oral fluid than serum. In each of these trials, more positives on oral fluid than serum, kind of a surprise. Day 3, similar results. Here they're tied, same rate of positivity. Here in day 21, more positive on oral fluid than serum. Here's trial 3, Minnesota 184, more positives on PCR in oral fluid than serum. So kind of surprising results that we had more positivity in oral fluids than serum, but perhaps you can explain that by remembering that tonsils are infected for quite some period of time, and very likely the source of virus in these samples is tonsil. Here's the antibody response in these animals. You can see some differences. This is serum on the left and oral fluids on the right. You can see some differences in IgM response among these trials, less so in IgA, and no difference on IgG. Similar results for oral fluids. Here's IgG, here's IgA, IgM. We're confirming that our observations earlier on detection of IgM, IgA, and IgG in oral fluids is true. We can look at the ELISAs, again, qualitatively, so yes or no, plus or negative. Here's our trial 1, here's trial 2, trial 3. Oral fluids and serum, everything's negative on day 0. Everything's negative on day 7. On day 14, we're approaching a high rate of positivity. Here in type 1, we have a little bit more positivity in oral fluid than serum than oral fluid. The other cases, they're tied. And by day 21, everything is positive, antibody positive. If you remember the PCR results, here's again our day 14 results where we've had 94% positive on oral fluid, 80% positive on serum. We've exceeded all those in ELISAs for that same period of time. And here we are on day 21, and PCR is 90% positive oral fluid, 79% positive in serum, whereas everything's positive, everything's antibody positive. So we have a system, we have PCRs and antibody assays that seem to work pretty well. The next question really was, how well is this system going to work in the field? Because, of course, in the field, some animals are going to be negative, some animals are going to be positive, some animals are going to be early in detection in infection, others later. So how well is this system going to work in the field? And so the question we tried to answer is that one. And if you remember these painted pigs, this is where they come in the picture. So the question was really, can we detect PRRS virus at low prevalence? The experimental design is relatively simple. We had 25 pens, 25 pigs per pen. Every case, 25 pigs per pen. We structured what we called treatments. We had 5 treatments and 5 pens in each treatment. And by treatment, I mean the prevalence of positive pigs in these pens. And so we had 5 pens that were negatives. These are negative controls, no positive pigs. We had 5 pens with 1 positive pig and 24 negative pigs. We had 5 pens with 3 positive pigs and 22 negative pigs. 5 pens with 5 positive pigs and 5 pens with 9 positive pigs. And so here's our prevalence: 0%, 4%, 12%, 20%, and 36%. So we set up a system, and we're going to see, can our tests identify correctly which pens are positive? And so here's going to be our timeline for conducting this study. We had to do this on 2 different farms. On farm 1 is where we're going to vaccinate these pigs. So we had 90 pigs that we vaccinated, and this date of vaccination is what we're going to call day 0. Everything else is in context to day 0. So day 13, day 19 is all referring to the date of vaccination. On day 13 in the morning, we had 535 negative pigs on farm 2. And remember, we had 25 pens. So we collected one oral fluid sample from each of these 25 pens, and we bled these 535 pigs. So these should be completely negative samples. On day 13, in the afternoon, we moved the 90 pigs from farm 1 to farm 2 and put them in the pens as we described. No pigs, or 1 pig, 3 pigs, whatever we called for in our treatments. In day 14 in the morning, and again this is day 14 days after vaccination, we collected oral fluid samples from all these 25 pens. We collected 5 oral fluids from each pen. And then after we collected those samples, we bled the 90 pigs that had been vaccinated. So that means, if you look at our tally sheet, that means we have serum from 625 pens, or excuse me, 625 pigs, 535 negative pigs, and 90 PRRS positive pigs. We have 150 oral fluid samples, that is 25 before we put the pigs in the pens, and 125 after we put the positive pigs in the pens. So what we did then was we aliquoted these samples and sent them to 6 different laboratories. Again, we need tests that are repeatable and reproducible. It's not very helpful if ours is the only lab that can perform these assays. And so we sent the tests to these 6 laboratories, all of whom had been running oral fluid diagnostics. They all had a procedure for running the PCRs, and they'd all been running the oral fluid assays as well. So here's our 6 laboratories, and they're going to be testing all our samples. So here's our prevalence, and to compare our final results, I want to compare that to our simple probability. So if I have 1 positive pig in a pen of 25, the probability that I can, at random, correctly select that 1 positive pig and test it is about 4%. It's a simple probability. If I have three positive pigs in that pen, the likelihood that I will, at random, select 1 of those positive pigs and test it is 12%, and so on and so forth. What we saw from our laboratories, and this is the mean among all labs, and I would say that it's important to recognize we had some labs that performed much better and some laboratories that performed not nearly as good. But this is the mean among all labs, and so we had 0.7%. This would be a false positive because there were no positive pigs in there. So we had a specificity of 99.3%. Here's our detection rate in pens with 1 positive pig, 15%. In 12% prevalence pens, 80% rate of detection. Here's our pens with 5 positive pigs. We had a 64% detection rate. This is not a mistake. You can see it had 80% and then 64%. These are the way the numbers came out. It's my job to present the numbers, not to make them look better. And then 90% detection rate at a 36% prevalence. So that's our PCRs. We can look at the equivalent data for the antibody detection. We had 0.3% false positives, so that'd be a specificity of 99.7%. Same detection rate at a 4%, a 15% detection rate, 63% positives, 85%, and 90%. Let's look at it. This is an easier way to look at that data. So here we have our probability of detection. Here's our simple probability. So at a 4% prevalence, we have a 4% probability of detection, right? And so on and so forth. Here's the analysis. This is logistic regression analysis of the data, right? 1 oral fluid sample and 1 serum sample down here. And so the point to make here is that this entire area in yellow is the increased probability of detection with 1 oral fluid sample versus 1 serum sample. And so with the pig sample, here's our 20% probability at the same prevalence level. For example, we had about a 75% probability of detection with oral fluids, 20% versus 70%. You can look at that another way also. You can say, okay, here's our observed oral fluid probability of detection. I'm going to say 15%, 45%, 75%, 95%, and that pretty much comes off here. To match that, you can do the calculations, they're simple to do. To match the 15% probability of detection at a 4% prevalence in a population of 25 pigs, you would need to bleed 4 pigs. Here we have a 12% prevalence. In our case, we saw 45% probability of detection with oral fluids. You would need to bleed 5 pigs. Again, 20% prevalence. In oral fluids, we saw a 75% probability of detection. You need to bleed 7 pigs. And here's our 36% prevalence. We saw 95% probability of detection using 1 oral fluid sample. You would need to bleed 8 pigs. And so we have a system that's much more sensitive, much more capable of detecting infection, even at low prevalence, than we ever can achieve bleeding individual animals. So historically, we've had a procedure based on representative sampling to decide how many samples we should collect in a field. How can we collect oral fluid samples that are not based on individual pigs? How can we collect these in a statistically valid method? And so I want to very briefly, here's our problem. We have these very complex sites, very complex systems. We have pigs segregated by age and stage. We have pigs entering the farm and leaving the farm at different areas or different periods of time. This is a complex population. It's much different than a human population. So the challenge is, how are you going to surveil this site? And you basically have 3 choices. Historically, we've used random sampling. More recently, we've looked at risk-based sampling, and what I'm going to propose we think about is systematic spatial sampling. Random sampling is what we've done in the past, and you can apply random sampling to pen-based sampling, and that's what I've done here. I said, okay, do 6 samples in each of these buildings. You can number the pens and then randomly allocate your sampling to pens. What you see here is large holes and then clusters of samples. Is this a good way to sample? Are you really going to know what's going on in the building? Probably not. Here's risk-based sampling, and classically in risk-based sampling, you either select samples from the hospital pen or from piglets post-weaning. Are those actually representative of the rest of the animals in the herd? Probably not. Here's the way that we're going to start thinking about it now, which is systematic spatial sampling. Once you decide how many samples you want to collect, you distribute them evenly across the space. What we've seen in practice is that, in fact, disease is very spatially located. You have some buildings where you have the infection, other buildings you don't. We need to sample from all the spaces. And this gives us a logical reason or logical way to do that. So systematic spatial sampling, I'm going to go a little faster, I see I'm running out of time. It's a uniform spatial allocation of samples. It's easy to understand. You can tell anybody how to do spatial sampling once you have your scheme set up. It's easily implemented. And surprise, surprise, it's actually widely used in many fields, especially environmental samples, or sciences, excuse me. Here's a quote from 1999. Systematic sampling, either by itself or in combination with some other method, may be the most widely used method of sampling. I never heard about it before, but this is what you see on the statistical side. And so here's a study. Here they used random sampling, and here's systematic sampling. Which gives the best coverage? Random to the left, systematic to the right. Same number of sampling points. This is the case from the US where there was a toxic spill in a water system, and they've used spatial sampling ever after to monitor what's happened to the chemical. This I like because it kind of represents what we do with pig production. The water's coming in, it's hanging around for a while, and it's leaving. Regardless, they have selected specific sites that they sample periodically. those results, those diagnostic results, link location and time. So they're statistically completely valid results, easy to analyze. So I want to do a very brief example of how this might look in the field. In this case, we looked at 10 weaned to finished barns of 1,100 pigs. In each of these 10 sites, we sampled 6 pens every 2 weeks for 18 weeks, so we had 600 samples, always selecting samples from the same pens. And here's how the data looked. And we're going to go very quickly. Here, initially, you see ELISA positive results. And let me go back. In white, we have ELISA negative and PCR negative. In yellow, ELISA positive. In purple, ELISA positive and PCR positive. And these red P's mean only PCR positive. So initially, we see lots of antibody, which could be maternal antibody. And now we know, we didn't at the time, this could also be spray-dried plasma. Since we only feed spray-dried plasma for a couple weeks post-weaning, all these buildings go ELISA negative up, except for building number 10, where we see a PCR positive and two PCR positives and one ELISA positive. In that building, you see 2 weeks later, 1, 2, 3, 4 PCR positives and 1, 2, 3, 4 ELISA positives. And thereafter, for the most part, you see only ELISA positives. In barn 9, this barn remains free of infection until the very last sampling, in which you see, here we have all negatives. 2 weeks later, everything's everything's ELISA positive and 1 PCR positive. In barn 6, we see this period of negativity, and then suddenly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ELISA positives, 1, 2 PCR positives. In barn 5, we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 PCR positives, no ELISA positives. 2 weeks later, we see no PCR positives, but everything's ELISA positive thereafter. This is another way to look at that data in each of these barns, and you can see that the PCRs are very coincident. They're occurring at the same time as ELISA positives. Each of these barns has a slightly different pattern, which was kind of a surprise for me. But you can see that the antibodies are responding very much to the PCRs. They're both giving us good information. Unexpected, I really thought the pattern of infection would be the same in these barns, but what we really saw was the pattern of infection different among barns. If you're not doing surveillance, you're not going to know exactly what the pattern of infection is in your barn. 2-week sampling was very effective for detecting changes. Once the virus appeared, it spread very quickly. Now, the 2-week sampling was very effective, but probably 6 samples per pen every 2 weeks was too many. This is an area we're working on now, trying to determine what number of samples is the correct number of samples. Interestingly, the PCRs and ELISAs, for the most part, coincided, or if you didn't have the every 2-week sampling, you would have missed, in one case at least, would have missed the PCRs. Now, the testing costs differ greatly between PCRs and ELISAs, at least in our lab. And so you have to decide what is your purpose in testing. Once you've decided what your purpose of testing is, you need to figure out which is the best test to use to achieve that purpose. I'm going to pass on this because I know we need to wrap it up. Apologies for running over. And so this is kind of a very brief overview of what we're doing and the potential for oral fluid diagnostics in surveillance. And so with that, I thank you very much. I do want to acknowledge this talk represented a lot of work from a lot of students whose input has been huge. It's a short talk. There's a lot more information. Please send me, email me your questions. I'd be glad to try to answer them. So thank you very much.